Hello students, welcome back to the ScienceCraft YouTube channel. Today we have a lecture video on ecology. Keep in mind these lecture videos don't go as in depth as our in-class sessions, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask me and I can expand on some of these topics later. So let us get into the lesson for today. So what is ecology? Ecology is the study of how living things on Earth interact with and rely on other living and non-living things in the environment where they live. So living things like plants and animals, as well as non-living things such as temperature and water. So ecology is studied at many levels, including organisms, populations, communities, ecosystems, and the biosphere. I will get into these levels later on in the lesson, but just keep in mind that ecologists study the big and the small. Now, there might be some confusion about the difference between environment and an ecosystem. Environment refers to the surroundings, whereas ecosystem is the interaction between the environment and the living organisms. So an environment is simply the area where living organisms live, and an ecosystem is the community where the biotic and abiotic elements interact with each other. Now, what are biotic and abiotic elements or factors? Abiotic factors or elements refer to the non-living physical and chemical elements in an ecosystem. Examples of abiotic factors are water, so think something like salinity, which is the salt content of a body of water, as well as ocean currents. And then there's air or wind, soil, sunlight/temperature, and the minerals within an ecosystem. So these are a few examples of abiotic elements within ecosystems. Keep in mind, non-living physical and chemical elements. There are also, of course, biotic elements or factors, which is any living component that affects another organism or the environment. This includes both animals that consume other organisms within their ecosystem and the organism that is being consumed. So biotic factors would include animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, and protists, which are single-celled organisms. Such as algae, that green slimy stuff that something forms in fish tanks. This can be an example of a protist. So together, biotic and abiotic factors make up an ecosystem and both play an important role in the way an ecosystem operates or functions. So next up we have our biomes. Ecologists also study biomes. A biome is a large community of plants and animals that live in the same major habitat and share common characteristics for the environment they exist in. Different biomes can be found all over the world and are distinct biological communities that have formed in response to a shared physical climate. Biomes are characterized by their vegetation, which is their plant life, their soil, their climate, which is like their weather, and their wildlife. So different biomes will have different types of vegetation, soil, climate, and wildlife. While there are 5 major types of biomes, they can be divided into even more specific categories, but our 5 major biomes are aquatic, grassland, forest, desert, and tundra. As I mentioned earlier, some of these biomes can be further divided into more specific categories, such as freshwater biomes, marine biomes, savannas, tropical rainforests, temperate rainforests, and taiga. But those are a little bit more complex, and we won't be getting into them in this lesson. So just to explain a little bit more about biomes, not every organism can survive in just any biome, of course, as organisms within a biome are specifically adapted for the conditions present in said biome. For example, trees cannot grow in the tundra biome as the tundra's permafrost, which is a layer of soil that remains frozen throughout the year, has a very thin active layer. This active layer is too thin for trees to grow because it cannot support a tree's roots. This is just one example, but just keep in mind that each biome is different and each organism is adapted to their biome. And here we have some examples of biomes, some in Minecraft. We have our aquatic biome right here, and we can see that's the coral reef. Then we have our grassland biome right there. Then we have our forest biome, and we have our desert biome and our tundra biome. So these are just the main 5 biomes we have on our Earth. Again, these can go far more specific, but these are just the main categorical biomes. And for our tundra biome, you won't always see snow everywhere in the tundra biome. Sometimes it will just be bare and have that frozen soil. So just keep in mind, tundra biomes can have snow, but not all the time. So now we have our levels of ecological organization. As I mentioned earlier, ecosystems are organized into several different levels, and an ecosystem can be studied at any one of the various levels of organization. So the first and smallest level we have is the organism slash individual slash species. This level can be referred to as any of these three words. So an individual is obviously an individual living thing that can breed with others of the same species to produce fertile offspring, and fertile means that they are able to have children. Individuals are not members of the same species if their members cannot produce offspring that can also have children. So obviously an individual organism should be able to produce with another individual organism of the same species and produce that fertile offspring. Our example here is a nice little Minecraft salmon, and this is just one salmon, so it's an individual. Our next level is the population. So a population is a group of organisms belonging to the same species that live in the same area and interact with one another. So we have all our salmon here. This is our population, and they're all in the same area. So keep in mind they have to be in the same area and have to be able to interact with one another. Our next level is community. A community is all of the populations of different species that live in the same area and interact with one another. A community is composed of all of the biotic factors of an area. Again, biotic factors are living, while abiotic are non-living. So here we have our salmon, then we also have some cod and some kelp and some seagrass. So these are all the living features of the area, and they're also able to interact with one another. Our next level is the ecosystem. And an ecosystem includes the living organisms, which is all the populations in an area, and the non-living aspects, otherwise known as the abiotic factors of the environment. An ecosystem is made up of the biotic and abiotic factors in an area. So here we have our salmon. Then we also have some kelp and seagrass in the background, but then we also have those abiotic factors like the water, so the ocean's salinity, its salt content. And then also we probably have those ocean currents, so the way the ocean moves and how powerful it is and in what direction. So we have those living, salmon, kelp, seagrass, and the non-living, the water of the ocean. So all these interact with one another. And in the background we also have a nice little squid, which is also another living factor that is able to interact with the salmon, the kelp, and the seagrass. So that is our ecosystem. And our last level of ecological organization is the biosphere, and this is the part of the planet with living organisms. The biosphere includes most of Earth, including part of the oceans and the atmosphere, and is made up of the parts of Earth where life exists, thus all our ecosystems. This is where land, water, and air interact with each other to support life. So all those living things are within our biosphere. So next up we have our food chains, and the term food chain describes the order in which organisms or living things depend on each other for food. So it shows how different organisms consume energy from one another. Every ecosystem or community of living things has one or more food chains. So most food chains start with organisms that make their own food, which are such as plants, and these are called producers. So our producer here in this particular food chain is our grass, and this again makes its own food. Organisms that eat other living things are known as consumers, and our first consumer here, our primary consumer, is our nice little sheep, and this sheep eats our producer, our grass. And then we have our another consumer, which is our wolf, and this wolf eats the sheep. So this wolf eats our primary consumer, and then the primary consumer eats our producer. So it's a nice little chain. And the last thing we have is our decomposers. So decomposers are often the final link in a food chain. Decomposers can be something like bacteria, fungi, which is mushrooms, worms, and other organisms that cause decay. When plants and animals die, decomposers break down their tissues. This then adds nutrients to the soil so that new plants can grow. Then the food chain begins all over again with our producers. So we have our nice little fungi, our mushroom here, and in the real world, our fungi would take the dead animal matter and decompose it and take those nutrients and put it back into the soil. So now we have something a little bit more complex, is our food webs, and a food web is a group of food chains within an ecosystem. Most living things eat more than one type of animal or plant, obviously, so their food chains overlap and connect. For example, the wolf that ate the sheep may also eat another organism, like a fox. And this makes the wolf a part of two food chains, thus a food web. So a combination of food chains is a food web. Organisms in food webs are grouped into categories called trophic levels. Roughly speaking, these levels are divided into producers, which is the first trophic level, consumers, and decomposers, which is the last trophic level. So I talked a little bit about some of these earlier, but I'm going to go a little bit more into depth here. So producers make up the first trophic level. They're also known as autotrophs, and they make their own food and do not depend on any other organism for nutrition. Most autotrophs use a process called photosynthesis to create food, and their food being a nutrient called glucose, and they use sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water to make this glucose. So we have a bunch of producers right here. We have a carrot, we have some hay, and some others. So these are our producers, and they make their own food, and they're that first trophic level in a food web. So while plants are the most familiar type of autotroph, there are many other kinds. Algae, which larger forms are known as seaweed, are autotrophic. Then we have phytoplankton, which are tiny organisms that live in the ocean. They're also autotrophs. And we have some types of bacteria are autotrophs as well. For example, bacteria living in active volcanoes use sulfur, not carbon dioxide, to produce their own food. This process is called chemosynthesis, but that's a little complex, and we won't be getting into that today. So our next level is our consumers. And the next trophic levels are made up of animals that eat producers, which again is our consumers. Consumers can be carnivores, which are animals that eat other animals, or omnivores, animals that eat both plants and animals. Omnivores are like people, like us, and they consume many types of foods. People eat plants, such as vegetables and fruits. We also eat animals and animal products, such as meat, milk, and eggs. So, for the most part, humans are omnivores, except for our vegetarian and vegan friends out there. But there are three types of consumers. There are primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. Primary consumers eat herbivores. Herbivores eat plants, algae, and other producers. So they only eat producers. And they are at the second trophic level. Primary consumers, second trophic level. So with our previous food chain, our primary consumer was our nice little sheep. So that was our primary consumer. Again, they eat those producers. It's an herbivore, so only eats plants, algae, and again, other producers. So next we have our secondary consumers, and secondary consumers eat herbivores. They eat our primary consumers, and they are at the third trophic level. So we had our wolf back there, which also ate our sheep, our primary consumers. So secondary consumers eat our primary consumers. Then we have tertiary consumers, and those eat the secondary consumers. They are at the fourth trophic level. So we have our wolf here, and wolves can be categorized as both, I suppose, tertiary and secondary consumers, because wolves can eat something like a fox, and foxes eat smaller animals, maybe like bunnies, and in real life, maybe like rats. So since our tertiary consumer, our wolf, is able to eat a secondary consumer, they'd be categorized as tertiary. So tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers. And again, they are at the fourth trophic level. And so just to sum it all up, tertiary consumers eat secondary consumers, our secondary consumers eat primary consumers, and our primary consumers eat producers. So relatively simple. Just keep all this in mind when you think about a food web. Next up, we have our detritivores and our decomposers, and these make up our last trophic levels. Detritivores are organisms that eat non-living plant and animal remains. For example, scavengers such as vultures eat dead animals, so it's already dead. And then dung beetles eat animal feces, which is animal poop. And typical detritivorous animals include millipedes, springtails, woodlice, dung flies, slugs, many terrestrial worms, sea stars, sea cucumbers, fiddler crabs, among some other organisms. Now, a decomposer is an organism that breaks down organic materials from dead organisms to obtain energy. They turn organic wastes, such as decaying plants, into inorganic materials, such as nutrient-rich soil. These organisms are basically recyclers, as they put the nutrients back into the soil, completing the cycle, as these nutrients are then used by our producers, or autotrophs. And examples of decomposers are fungi, so our mushrooms, worms, and bacteria. So, in conclusion, decomposers break down their food externally and consume nutrients on a molecular level, while detritivores eat large amounts of decaying material and excrete nutrients. So, another last thing that is important to remember when examining food webs is the 10% energy law or rule. This law states that the transfer of energy in a food web or food chain is limited. Thus, the number of trophic levels in a food chain or web is limited as well. So, when energy is passed in an ecosystem from one trophic level to the next, only 10% of that energy will be passed on. We can see this here as the producers are first trophic level here, only 10% of that energy is passed on. So they start off with 100% energy, and as we go into the next trophic level, only 10% of that 100% is transferred, meaning the second trophic level only has 10% energy. This continues with our next trophic level, and then our next one, with each trophic level only receiving 10% of the lower trophic level's energy. This energy is biomass, by the way, and a biomass is essentially the mass of living biological organisms in a given area or ecosystem at a given time. Biomass can refer to a species biomass, which is the mass of one or more species, or to a community's biomass, which is the mass of all species in the community. It can include microorganisms, plants, or animals. And biomass contains stored energy. So when biomass is burned or used, heat is released, and heat is energy, which is why we lose energy as we go up the trophic levels. So that is all for this lesson today. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you all were able to take something away from this lesson. Bye, everyone.